All right, I guess we start now. It's a little bit weird because there's just a timer that ends and then we start the session, and I'm assuming people are here. But this session is getting answers to your Drupal questions. And if that's what you're here for, you're in the right spot. I thought we could start out with introductions. There are two of us that are going to be presenting today, and so we'll start with introductions and then kind of get into the session from there. My name is Joe, Joe Schindelar. I'm EOJ the Brave on Drupal.org and Slack and Twitter and most Drupal things. That's a good place to find me if you have questions and want to follow up after this. Otherwise, I'm a developer and a trainer. I work at Drupalize.me. And that experience of being a Drupal developer for almost 15 years at this point and doing and leading lots of different forms of training are what led to a lot of the tips that I'm going to be sharing and drawing on that experience. And then presenting with me also is going to be Ashley. Ashley, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Jones. I am people support for Drupalize Me. So when you send questions or want to set up an account, I'm the person that you talk to. You can find me on Twitter at ARyan, AYE_RIAN. And I've been involved with the Drupal community for about the last 2 years. So my perspective is a little bit different. But still, I think I have a lot of really important and relevant things to help you out with.
Awesome. So today, Ashley and I are going to draw on that experience that we have both as Drupal developers and helping teach Drupal and providing support for people who are learning Drupal to share some tips and what we think is a good process for finding answers to your Drupal-related questions. Our process looks like this. There's 5 steps. It starts with the basics, read the manual, then use the information that you get from doing that to help craft better search queries. Try and solve the problem on your own first, maybe struggle with it a bit. It's okay if you can't find an answer on your own, but it's good to spend some time trying before you then go and ask questions or call for help. Ask your peers, get an answer, hopefully solve your problem, and then finally pay it forward by making sure that the path to an answer is easier for the next person who comes after you. I'm going to talk about the first 3 items on this list and mostly share some of my favorite manuals and tips for using them. And then Ashley's going to take over and talk about the more human side of asking and answering questions. So you can expect about halfway through the presentation, there'll be a pause for a moment while we switch presenters. One of the key themes of this presentation is going to be that if you want other people to be willing to help you, you have to demonstrate that you're willing to put in the work first. And I think for me, that means that you need to take the time to quote unquote read the manual and use it as the starting point for creating the questions that you want to ask. And honestly, I think this is true both for people who have been doing Drupal for just a couple of weeks and are just getting started, but also for those of us who have been doing this for years. Demonstrating that you're willing to read the manual is an important first step to getting answers to your questions. And when I say read the manual, I'm not trying to say that in like a patronizing sort of RTFM way. For me, this is all about the fact that you have to climb up the first step of a ladder before you can climb up to the second step or the third step or to get any higher. And that reading the manual is all about using one resource, the starting resources, to unlock your access to other more advanced resources that'll hopefully help you get answers to your question. Most of us learn Drupal on a curve that looks maybe something like what's on the screen here. And depending on where you are in that learning curve, different resources are going to be available to you. Things like conference sessions and technical articles, which are super useful, might not be accessible to someone who's just getting started and hasn't yet read the manual and gained some of the terminology and framework that is necessary to be able to understand those more advanced documents. All the things that I'm going to talk about are on this list, and I've tried to roughly group them. Most of them are probably not new to you if you've been using Drupal for any period of time, but hopefully this is going to help contextualize them a bit more and make it a little bit more efficient to use them. Also, remember that a learning curve like this, it applies to you no matter the size of the thing that you're learning or where you are in the journey. I think of like my Drupal learning journey is really made up of a bunch of smaller versions of this curve superimposed onto the curve itself. Whether I'm learning Drupal as a whole, I might go through this curve, but also when I'm learning how to use the form API or entity access, that is a learning curve of itself as well. So I start off in Drupalize Me's support queue. A lot of the questions that we get, the answer is, oh, I think what you're looking for is views, or some combination of like views and content types and entity reference. I joke a lot about we could just write a support bot that answers all of people's Drupal's questions by responding with, have you heard of the views module? And then maybe a link to the docs, kind of jokingly, right? Of course, if you've never heard of views, if you don't know the words entity reference, you certainly can't be expected to find the information that explains how to use them. So it's a valid question, but I think it really just helps point out the importance of doing that groundwork to read the manual and understand the terminology in order to more efficiently answer your questions. When I say read the manual, I don't think there's any one specific Drupal manual that everyone can go and read. And rather, I'm thinking about sort of highly curated, well-edited tutorials, things like the Drupal user guide, sites like drupalize.me or Drupal Easy or Debug Academy, or the training that you can get that goes with conferences like this one or local Drupal camps, various different sources that will help introduce you to a topic. Parts of this slide won't load. Try it again. Reload. Next one. Uh-oh. Let's try. I'm going to skip ahead a couple and see if it's just the images on this set of slides. Yeah, it is. Okay. So I was going to talk about api.drupal.org in those slides. And if you've ever written code for Drupal at all, you're familiar with api.drupal.org. It is where Drupal's core APIs and all of the code that make up Drupal core is documented. Really, it's created from parsing PHP comments that are in the files that make up Drupal core. And it provides a useful utility for browsing through that content and finding information about the very specific ways that Drupal works. I think of it as being the place that you go if you want to know what arguments to pass to a particular hook implementation or a function. It's a very detailed, low-level documentation. And unfortunately, since those slides aren't working, I can't show this, but on api.drupal.org, there's a couple of useful tools that I think are easy to overlook, specifically the topics page. So if you're on the site and there's a sidebar on the right-hand side, there's a link for topics. And if you click on topics, that'll give you a big list of different sort of core subsystems. And essentially, this is like the manual for each of those subsystems. And if you want to learn about the form API, you could start by reading the form API topic page. And it helps introduce a lot of the concepts that are important to understand with the form API. Additionally, on that site, there are aggregate pages, which list things like all of the services that are in Drupal 8's or Drupal 9's service container. And I find that to be a useful utility in those moments where you're like, I think that Drupal probably has an API that I can use to format a date or make HTTP requests, but I can't remember what it is. api.drupal.org has some lists like that where you can browse through all of the features provided by core and figure out the one that you're looking for and how to make use of it. So if api.drupal.org is where you go for details about specific function calls, then the examples for developers project, which is on the screen here in this slide, is where you're going to go if you want to take a step back and learn how all of the different moving parts that make up any of those subsystems work. The examples project is a module that consists of a few dozen submodules, each of which provides a very well documented and complete working example of how to use one of these Drupal APIs. Examples of, say, sending an email or writing unit tests or displaying and processing forms that users can fill out. Tons more of examples. I find this project to be amazing. It is by far my favorite place to go to copy and paste answers from and then modify them and make them my own. And also, the documentation in here is really good. Think of this as like, I want to see all the pieces that make up the form API in action. And a pro tip, if the thing that you want an example of isn't already in the project, there's a good chance there's code for it in the issue queue that's still a work in progress, but that work in progress is probably useful and often good enough to learn from. So take a look there if you can't find a already finished example in the examples project. Another thing I recommend checking out is the weekly drop, which is a email newsletter that's a roundup of all the important news and notable tutorials that have appeared in the community and the ecosystem in the previous week. It's less of a like destination that you're going to go to in order to answer or find an answer to a specific question. And this is more about kind of keeping up with what's going on, keeping track of changes in the community and evolving best practices. And I think this is important when it comes to answering your own questions, to just sort of have a pulse on where the community's at. Also, I find that I'll read the tutorials that are linked here, even if they don't apply to what I'm trying to do today, just to kind of serve as a like, later on, I might come across a problem where I go, I feel like I read a tutorial about this once. I'm sure this is possible, and go back and find those answers later on. It's definitely worth the time. So of course, once you've read the manual, you're probably still stuck because the manual, those highly polished tutorials, right? They're like step-by-step guides on how to accomplish something, but it's probably not exactly the feature that you're looking for. So now you need to go and apply that to your specific use case. And here your goal is to combine the knowledge that you gain from the manual, like the word views or the term entity reference, with your specific problem and try to craft the perfect search query so that when you search Google, it returns the right answers. Easy, right? Yeah, not so much. But I actually, before I go and search Google, for certain types of problems, I actually go to the change records first. If you're not familiar with change records, they're at drupal.org/list-changes. And whenever there's an update made to the code that makes up Drupal core, public-facing features and APIs or best practices, really, change records get created that document what changed. And I find these are really helpful because they often show before and after examples that you can, again, copy and paste from, which is useful. They sometimes have comments that can help contextualize the information. And if your question is of the type of like, I know how to do this. I used to do this in Drupal 7, and I remember this is how I do it. And now in Drupal 8, how do I do the same thing? Change records can be really useful for that. Like, I used to do Y. I know there's a new way to do it, X. There's probably a change record that will help you translate that existing knowledge to the current version. If there's not a change record, or even if there is, you still end up probably performing a search to try to find more information. Here's where you use all that terminology that you've already learned from reading the manual and change records and such, and combine it with maybe whatever error messages you're seeing when you're trying to accomplish something, or details about your specific question, and try to get an answer. One of the things that I like to do is I actually like to use Google to search Drupal.org. And if you do site:/Drupal.org in the Google search query, and then your query, all the results that it will return will be from Drupal.org. And I kind of start there as well. Maybe this will help turn up a change record or an issue that'll help me understand my problem. I also, if I'm searching for like, I need to find a module that does X, or I'm wondering if there's a module that integrates with views that provides this new feature, searching Drupal.org is a great way to try to find that information. And if you're not finding it on Drupal.org, you can just remove that part of the search query and expand it so that now you're getting results from everything on the internet. And there's tons of resources out there that'll come up. One of them that I find that I land on very often and that is particularly useful is Drupal Answers. It's a super awesome resource. It's kind of the same thing as Stack Exchange, except for in this case, it is specific to Drupal. And if you've ever done development work before, you know that Stack Exchange is the place that you go to copy and paste answers. And that is true with Drupal development too. I will point out that there's also a support forum on Drupal.org, drupal.org/forum, which is also useful. And I'm not even going to necessarily say that one is better than the other, but in my experience, I find that I prefer the Drupal Answers site for a couple of reasons. I feel like it gets a little more traffic and therefore more eyes on questions. I like that answers get upvoted, correct, quote unquote, correct answers are upvoted, but I like the way that that kind of resurfaces answers and keeps them in the sort of people's view rather than falling off the end of the list because now they're old. Because sometimes an answer that's 5 years old is still relevant today. I also, and then I like the way that Stack Exchange allows for kind of collaboration on creating and documenting answers. Another really useful resource that you might end up on is Drupal.tv, or more specifically, all of the talks from conferences like this one or camps, previous DrupalCons, are mostly recorded. There's a really amazing community initiative to record all of these talks at Drupal events. It's been going on for years, which means there's just a wealth of these talks available to learn more information. I kind of put these somewhere between like technical documentation and like the weekly drop newsletter. They tend to dive deep into the specifics of some particular aspect of Drupal that requires you to have quite a bit of prerequisite knowledge in order to understand the topic. And they're also usually a bit more like, here's a snapshot in time, the current state of things. But they're a great way to kind of keep up with what's going on in the ecosystem. And finally, after you've searched for a bit and you land on Drupal Answers or the example project or whatever, you found some code, the next thing you're going to want to do is try it on your own. Take your specific problem and try to solve it using the advice that you found from your searching. There's a couple of different ways that you can do this. The one thing that I will say is be careful to make sure you're not doing this on your live site and that you have some kind of development environment or safe place to test these things out. A really good one of those safe places is the simplytest.me website. If you're not familiar with it, you can go to simplytest.me, and with a click of just a couple of buttons, you can spin up a temporary Drupal site that you can muck around with, install modules that you want to test out, add additional projects that you maybe want to test out as well. I find that this is super useful for that scenario where you've just read about 2 or 3 modules and you want to see which of them is going to best solve your problem, or even just if this particular one is going to solve your problem. You can quickly spin up a site, test out the module. If it works or if it doesn't work, it's all hosted in the cloud. So when you're done, you can just walk away. There's nothing that you need to clean up. You don't have to worry about the implications on your production site. So it's very useful for that. I also find it can be helpful for me when I'm trying to answer questions for people and support, because it's like I can never remember the path to configure the Path Auto module or what the name of the field is. And I can just quickly spin up a site, find the path that I want to tell somebody about, maybe take a screenshot. This is a useful way to do that. Another useful tool in the same vein is the Drush Run Evaluate print loop. If you have Drush installed and you run the Drush PHP command, what it will do is open up a PHP runtime with a fully bootstrapped version of Drupal. And for me, this is the place that I can go and type in the PHP code, or rather copy and paste PHP code that I found on the internet, and I want to test it out. And it's useful because it's oftentimes quicker than, for example, trying to write a module with a controller with the code in the right place so that when I visit a URL on the site, I can hit refresh and see if it worked or not. Here in the Drush Run Evaluate print loop, I get pretty quick feedback. It has some useful tools for debugging. Another thing that I find this can be really useful for is maybe your question is like, how do I get the title of this particular entity or the value of this particular field? And I found something that looks kind of like the answer I want on Stack Exchange. I can go here and test it out, but I can do so with my specific data set and sort of change the names of things in order to match what my site is using, which is really helpful. You're certainly going to run into situations, though, where you do all of that, you test it out, and you still can't find an answer. And so the next step that you're going to want to do is to take all of that information from your trial and error and previous research and use it to ask a friend. I'm going to talk quickly about 2 places that I think are useful to find friends, I suppose. And then Ashley's going to take over from there. The first one is if you have access to a local user group, these can be an invaluable resource. As a global community, there's a Drupal as a global community means that there's a really high chance that there are other people who are physically close to you that are also doing Drupal and also have Drupal questions and also love to sit down and nerd out about weird Drupal things. Groups.drupal.org is a great place to try to find that local community and start building relationships now so that when you have questions later, you've got a group of people that you can ask them to. And then, of course, another great place is online. Tools like Slack, which is very popular. There's also a Rocket Chat Drupal instance, which is gaining traction. And these are a great place to go to ask quick questions and troubleshooting advice. If you don't have people in your local community that are easy to access and talk to, this can be a great place to sort of ask the broader community. And we're going to switch now, and Ashley's going to take over.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, am I good?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. Okay, so this next section is going to be about how to ask good questions. So you've done everything that you can do to answer your question on your own, and you're still a little stuck. You've decided that you're going to ask either your local user group, Slack, or maybe even you have a friend that you can talk to. In this section, we'll just go over a few tips to help ensure that you get the answers that you're looking for. Supposedly, there are no bad questions. Technically, that's true, but there are definitely ways to make your questions better and to help ensure that you get answers that are most helpful to you. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is make sure that our question is focused and clear. Make sure that your question isn't too vague. Be sure to reference documentation before you reach out to help because it'll help acclimate you to the vocabulary and the terminology to help get your question answered. For example, if the thing you want to make is a donation button, and you ask that question to like our support inbox, we're not sure what that is. Is it a link to PayPal, a product someone can add to their cart for purchase? The wording of this question makes it more difficult to give you a specific answer. You also want to be sure that you explain how you encounter the problem that you're facing. This will help us be able to help you solve the problem. It helps for us to know where you are in the process. What have you done to attempt to solve the problem? And did you encounter an error or are you confused about a specific task or concept? Understanding the factors around the question will help us figure out how to best help you answer the question. Be specific as possible about what you're asking and the answer that you're hoping to get. Open-ended questions like, how do I use X module, are really vague and very time-consuming and hard to answer in a meaningful way for you. A better way to ask that question might be, I'm trying to use X module to accomplish Y. I've read the documentation and attempted A, B, and C, and I'm still having some difficulty getting to Y. And last but not least, proofread, read, and then reread your question just to make sure it makes sense. It'll help you get an answer faster. It'll help the person reading your question understand what you're asking. And it's just good practice. Next, you want to be sure you understand why you're asking. Make sure that you're clear on that. There's a difference between really deeply learning something and then learning just enough to answer a specific question or solve an immediate problem. And both are valid. Neither one is wrong, but knowing which one you're trying to accomplish will help you get to your goal faster. Um, if your goal is to learn, like be prepared to take notes and practice and explore. And if you want a quick solution to a problem, make sure that you have a way to test it out quickly and then a way to keep track of what you've already tried. Give relevant details. So the more information that you can provide, the better that people will be able to assist you. Um, Things like what version of Drupal you're using, your hosting environment, etc., can be really helpful for the person on the other end to help you with your question. And assuming that you've taken a shot at solving the problem on your own, be sure to include all of the information around what you did and the results. It can help eliminate any repetitive work so you guys don't do the same thing over and over. And it's also helpful to know if you get any error messages or anything unique to your problem. So again, we can help you a little bit better. And also, others are just more likely to assist if they see that you've taken initiative to do it on your own versus just popping into a forum and hoping someone will do the work for you. Know your audience. So hopefully you've given a bit of thought to where you're asking your question. It's important to make sure that you're asking it in the right channels. Be mindful of the forum you're using and who you're speaking to, and try to tailor your question and expectations for that audience. For example, if you're asking a question in Slack, be mindful of what channel you're in and make an attempt to find the channel that best supports the question you're asking versus just throwing your questions out into the general forum. Also keep in mind that Slack is transient, so your question and answer will eventually be lost if you don't record it, which you absolutely should. And be nice. Be nice is not a hard concept, but it's one that people forget, especially because we're all online. It's important to just remember that there's a human on the other end of the question you're asking, and most times they can't hear you or see you, and that creates room for miscommunication. So just take a minute to make sure that your tone is friendly and inviting. And even if this person doesn't have all of the answers or is not able to help you, like it's awesome that they're even willing to try to help out. Be sure that you're treating people the way that you want to be treated. And also just keep in mind that you're requesting help from someone who likely has many other things to do. And the way that you're speaking to them will likely have an impact on the response you get. Excuse me. And then say thank you. A little bit of appreciation goes a long way. It also encourages people to continue to assist others and then to want to help you out in the future. Pay it forward. Don't be a support leech. So now that your question is answered, is there an opportunity to pass the information along to help other people or future you? Is there documentation that you can update? How can you use what you've learned in your experience to help the Drupal community? Or can you share it with your local user group? Paying it forward generates good karma for you because people will remember you and remember that after they helped you with this question, you took that information and moved on to continue the work. And it's also helpful for you, and like I said, future you, because you'll likely need that information again. Okay, so I've pulled together a few sample questions from our Drupalize Me support inbox, just as examples. So example 1 says, I was reading Dropdown with Ajax article. I'm having a hard time to get it to work with 2 selects. Second select, it has multiple select. Please help. Thank you. Okay, so we see that this question is very vague. It doesn't give us any context around what they're trying to do. They could tell us more about the specific issue they're facing and what the goal is. Ideally, it'd be helpful to hear like what they've already tried, the results, what they got from those results, just more. So all in all, this is not a good question. Thumbs down. Example 2 says, how do I use a plugin? I need to make a machine name of a label, and I know there's a plugin called migrate.process. I've tried many iterations of this class and reading about plugins here. My latest attempt using Drush PHP is that output, which fails unknown method. How would you use an available plugin? So this question gives us a lot more context. It lets us know that they tried, the results they got, what they're working on. And it's a lot easier for us to be helpful in a situation like this. So they get a green check mark. It's a much better question. So let's try it, right? Let's assume the question that you have for yourself is, how do I get all the article node objects? It's clear based on the question that you have some familiarity with Drupal. Perhaps you've read the manual, just based on your vocabulary and using words like node. So after this, we do a search for getting a list of article nodes that might eventually lead us to Stack Exchange. In reviewing Stack Exchange, you'd find that your question has already been asked and answered a few different times. So based on your use case and the goal that you're trying to accomplish, select a few to try out. You can use Drush PHP to test them and to see what works. If none of the answers seem to fit your use case, you'd move forward with asking the Drupal community for help. Be sure to think through your question, make sure it's focused, you understand why you're asking, that you're providing relevant details, you know and consider your audience, and you're being kind. An example of the question that you may pose might be, how do I get all article node objects in Drupal 8? I'm attempting blank, and I've tried X and Y. Both attempts result in error messages, A, B, C, D. Any help that anyone can provide would be greatly appreciated. So you've given everybody context. They understand what you're looking for. They understand what you've already done. It makes it much easier for someone to jump in and help you. And then after you've received your answer, be sure to pay it forward. Use your knowledge to help others in the Drupal community and gain some good karma. All right. So to wrap it all up, here is a recap of our recommendation of an efficient process for getting answers to your Drupal questions. Start with the manual and familiarize yourself with the problem space so you can formulate better questions. Combine that with your specific problem and start searching. Try the suggestions you find, see what works and what doesn't, and if you're lucky, this might be sufficient. If not, it's time to ask for help. Reach out to your network, ask your question, be specific, provide details, and be kind, and you'll get better results. Finally, pay it forward and make it easier for the next person. Thank you, guys. That's all we've got. We'll try and answer a few questions with whatever time we've got left. And just a heads up, even after the session ends, we'll be able to keep answering questions and we'll do our best or tweet at either one of us. At the end, you can export all the questions. So maybe we'll do that.
There's a few minutes left, and if people have any questions right now, I suppose either about this session or maybe general Drupal questions, you can ask them in the platform's Q&A block. Otherwise, we'll hang out for a few minutes, and thank you. You don't need to be self-conscious about asking questions. You just have to read, sorry, somebody left this in the discussion, said, now I'm self-conscious about asking questions. That's not the goal. The goal is to help you feel more confident in asking questions, because now you'll, have a template. Remember, like, if I'm gonna ask a question, I just need to make sure that I'm being nice when I do so. I share as much relevant detail as I can. right? And sometimes that relevant detail, like we said at the beginning, is like, I just want to make a list of recipes in Drupal. And the answer is like, oh, the answer is views. I can tell you're new to Drupal because you didn't know that you should be using the views module. Let me help you find those resources. But the more context you can provide, the less work it is for the person answering the question to provide a relevant answer, which means you're more likely to get an answer versus something that's really vague. Like, can you help? It's like, I don't know, maybe?
Perhaps.
Someone just asked the question, don't you think that this talk should be in the Drupal docs for beginners? Question mark. I do, smiley face. Yes, there's on Drupal.org, they're in the getting involved section of the documentation, and in a couple of places, like everything on Drupal.org. There's like 3 or 4 places you could go to find this, essentially the same information. There are some documents that try to help explain sort of Slack community etiquette. If you're going to ask questions in Slack, please be mindful of people's time and the fact that it's mostly volunteer, or it's all volunteer, and try to provide relevant information. But yeah, I could see how it would be nice to have that maybe surfaced a little bit higher up so that when people are first getting started with Drupal, it's easier to find access to that, right? Because that assumes you know what Slack is and that you know that you could go to Slack
Right.
to ask a question in the first place. Another question is, I often hit a problem and look up the info online, but then I find that many of the answers I find are old and relate to an old version of Drupal. You end up wasting a lot of time like that because people often don't say which version they're talking about. Yes, true statement. The scenario is you had a question about how to do something with an API and you look it up on Google and you find a blog post and it looks like it's going to be relevant, and then, or it is relevant if you're using, Drupal 6 or Drupal 7, but you're not. And so now it's, how do you make use of the information? A couple thoughts about that is the change records that we talked about can be a sometimes useful way to help translate the knowledge that's in that older article to a current version of Drupal, assuming that you know that this is from an older version when you're reading it. That can be hard because oftentimes people aren't explicit in their post, in their article, about which version of Drupal or which version of a module they're talking about. You can sometimes get at that information a little bit just solely based off of date, if they're displaying a date of when the piece of content was created. If not, yeah, it can be really challenging. The flip side of that is we definitely want to encourage people, when you're writing about Drupal and answering questions, provide that context. What version of Drupal are we talking about? Or at least provide a date to go with it. And another thing, as the person doing the searching, let's say you come across an answer, if it's on Drupal.org or Stack Exchange, or it's in a place where you have permission to make changes, edit it and make a change and make a note that, like, hey, this is for an older version of Drupal, so that future you doesn't get hung up on the same thing. I can't tell you the number of times that I've not known how to do something with Drupal. So then I start Googling and I find an answer. And then I'm like, holy cow, I wrote this answer like 5 years ago. Thanks, previous me. Because I guess it turns out like I probably write my search queries in the same way every time. And so I keep finding my own answers, but taking the time to make those changes is going to be beneficial for you and others in the future. Cool. It feels very ominous to like not actually be able to see anyone that is in the session.
Yeah, it's very strange.
But I think we can go ahead and I'll end it in just a second. And thank you again for everyone that attended. If you have additional questions, you can ask them on the sessions page on the on-air platform. And we will, Ashley and I will continue to have access to that and be able to answer those questions, or find us on Twitter or on Slack, and we're happy to help out. So I'm gonna click the leave button and
Yeah, I'm going to
end
stop
this.
sharing.
Yeah.
All right. Bye, everyone.